The views expressed, opinions given, and any communication made between the hosts and guests of What Are You Afraid of Horror and Paranormal Show do not necessarily reflect the views or opinions of Para X Radio, EMC Network, or all services that play this show. The hosts and services are not responsible for the actions of their guests, and the original rights of all intellectual property is retained by the creator, and all work is used with either permission or Creative Commons license. The show is for entertainment purposes only. I'm horror author T. Fox Dunham.
And I'm horror author and filmmaker Phil Thomas.
And tonight we're asking you,
what are you afraid of?
This is episode 150 of What Are You Afraid of Horror and Paranormal Show, Vampire Lore, with, guess who? Dacre Stoker. Hello, Phil, how are you?
Oh, I am wonderful. We're out of the 40s and into the 50s, huh? 150.
Yeah, this is 150. We've recorded 150 episodes over the last 5 years, and we're just about to hit 250,000 direct downloads off Libsyn, and that doesn't even come close to counting our Para X audience or the audiences of all the podcast services that don't use the Libsyn countdown system. So we're doing pretty well.
Yeah, we sure. Yeah, like you said, that's just Libsyn alone, not counting all the others. So
right.
Yeah, we're coming along. We're coming along great.
So keep the faith. Produce a professional product. Keep the faith. Just keep going. And it's Halloween again. Halloween 2020, a time of COVID. Have you been doing anything fun to celebrate Halloween this week?
This week, more than any other week, I've been watching a bit more horror films. Mm-hmm. Kind of been getting into it a bit more and adding a little more decorations, things like that. You know, I have a little bit of bad news though. This is very 2020, of course.
Okay.
The Great Pumpkin, Charlie Brown, will not be airing this year. Can you believe it?
God, those bastards.
I know.
God.
Just when you think 2020 can't get any more, 2020, they go and decide not to air The Great Pumpkin, Charlie Brown this Halloween season. And the reason being is because Apple Plus picked it up and you can stream it on there. But I mean,
this is getting crazy. That's something I talked about in the review I did of the Mortuary Collection, which is actually available on our website. Well, Phil and I have been enjoying Shudder. We watched Creepshow, the series, and I went over and caught the Mortuary Collection, which is brand new this year. It was a wonderful program, but that's something I talked about was usually all my favorite horror movies are on one streaming service, but we have so many dealers at the table now that to watch all of them, you would need 10 of them.
Yeah, I know, and it's just getting out of hand now.
It really is in The Great Pumpkin, but you can see it online somewhere, I'm sure, if you go onto YouTube. But
no, it was on there about 4 or 5 years ago, and they pulled it.
Oh, might have to order it then. But you can always go watch How I Met Your Mother with the Slutty Pumpkin, which is...
Wait, I'm not familiar with that. What is that?
It was a Great Pumpkin sort of spoof, and instead of it being the Great Pumpkin, the main character waits all night, every Halloween, for this woman that he met 5 years ago to return in a slutty pumpkin outfit. And
okay.
Which is something Alison introduced to me. But we're having fun this Halloween. This is episode 150, Vampire Lore with Dacre Stoker on What Are You Afraid of Horror and Paranormal Show. We're on Para X Radio, Friday nights at 9 p.m. And check us out at our website at www.whatayouafraidofpodcast.com for our new subcategories of ghost stories. I'm adding ghost stories every day from the archive. I'm getting them up there, and they're very popular. Plus a page for every episode of the show, and new fiction can be found there. Plus articles like the article I just wrote, my review of the Mortuary Collection, which was a lot of fun on Shudder, which I know you're enjoying too right now.
I am. In fact, I finished Creepshow.
Excellent.
I thought it was great.
Did you like it?
I loved it.
Yeah.
I thought it was the essence of the first Creepshow from, I believe it's 82.
Yeah.
Stephen King and George Romero, and also Creepshow 2, which I love that movie as well.
It was tactile. It was so nice not to see special effects that looked like a cartoon. You actually had air bladders exploding.
And so many practical effects. It was great.
So that was a lot of fun. I've enjoyed that too. But we've got a special guest on the show tonight, and everybody's going to recognize his last name. He's got that name recognition, but he's quite a tremendous author in his own right. Dacre Stoker is the great-grandnephew of Bram Stoker and the international best-selling co-author of Dracula, the Undead, produced by Dutton 2009, the official Stoker family-endorsed sequel to Dracula. Dacre is also the co-editor with Elizabeth Miller of the Lost Journal of Bram Stoker, The Dublin Years, put out by Robson Press in 2012. His latest novel, Dracul, a prequel to Dracula, released in October 2018, co-authored with J.D. Barker, has been sold to Putnam in North America, Penguin Random House in the UK, and many additional international publishers with a list of countries that goes on, with the film rights purchased by Paramount Studios.
And he was a native of Montreal, Canada. Dacre taught physical education and sciences for 22 years in both Canada and the U.S. He currently lives in Aiken, South Carolina, together with his wife, Jen. They manage the Bram Stoker estate. Check out his website at dacrestoker.com.
Dacre, it's wonderful to have you on the show. How are you?
Gentlemen, I'm wonderful. This is my time of the year. As you guys probably imagine, Halloween for a Stoker is like, the Super Bowl that we qualify for every year. It's awesome.
Oh, yeah.
Excellent. I love that. Halloween for a Stoker is like the Super Bowl, because we're probably not getting the Super Bowl this October.
I have a really awesome leather-bound copy of Dracula by Bram Stoker. I wish I could
take a picture. I'll post it with this episode.
Oh, well.
This is great having you here, Mr. Stoker.
Thank you. Thank you.
So what was it like growing up as a member of the Stoker family?
I don't want to start off with like the boring, dull answer, but I've got to put this in perspective. In the 60s and early 70s, there was a lot of interest in Dracula, but there was not a whole lot of interest in Bram Stoker. So I was kind of under the radar. It's not like we were like the Munsters or the Addams family growing up in Montreal and all the friends would, go crazy. But I did get a fair amount of ribbing at Halloween. Like, what's going to happen when we come to your house? Are you guys going to give us candy or take blood? And finally, about the age of 13 or so, I said, Dad, what's the big deal? He said, well, son, it's time to tell you the story. And we went to our library, downstairs in the house, and he pulled out this mustard yellow book, and it happened to be a first edition of Dracula that Bram actually signed to his mom and passed on to another brother, and somehow it made its way to our household. And he said, when you're ready, you got to read this book. But what was funny about it, guys, is that he knew about the book. He just didn't know how the rest of the world really embraced or thought about Bram Stoker. Our relation is that Bram's youngest brother, George, is our great-grandfather. So he was one of 7 kids in the family. Bram's line had one son, they had a daughter. And so there are no more Stokers alive, but there are Macaws and Dobbs alive in that family. And then of the 7, only George's family has offspring. So they're not too prolific. Either they died in strange ways. I know there were some childbirth issues. So it's not like we're a super large family that goes around at family reunion, beat our chests and say, hey, we're relatives of the famous Bram Stoker. It's more kind of laid back and kind of casual. And it's lucky that, as I tell people all the time, a lot of credit to McNally and Florescu, who wrote In Search of Dracula, that they're the ones that taught the Stoker family more about Bram Stoker than anybody within the family. And that's where I cut my teeth on it, reading that book and then reading a first edition of Dracula, which I'm embarrassed to say I did flip through those pages to read the book.
And that's amazing that someone else taught you guys your mythology and everything about, your family lineage. And to this day, I'm sure, and I could be wrong, but when you tell people, you're a descendant of Bram Stoker, I'm sure you get a pretty interesting reaction most of the time.
Yeah, it's usually kind of look at you and then they think, wait a sec, was your guy the vampire or did you write about the vampire? It takes a couple of seconds to kind of figure it out. And then, oh, what was Bram Stoker like? Where did he get all this information? There's this great fascination, as I'm sure we'll chat about in an interview, because Bram didn't leave really any hints. He didn't write an autobiography. There have been some biographies about him, and some of them are accurate and some are not, because not a whole lot of information floats about. And again, it goes back to McNally and Florescu. They actually found in the Rosenbach Museum in Philadelphia the actual notes that Bram prepared his novel Dracula with. Even the Rosenbach people to this day, as fine an institution that is, they really don't know how those got there. That's one of the cool mysteries, and that's really what spurred me on to sort of be where I am today is, okay, this is enough. Somebody in the family's got to figure out the stories for ourselves and pull back the curtain and look through the boxes, and which I have done and we'll chat about. But it's been cool. I say that being the relative opens up the doors, especially, when I'm a budding writer, but it also means that you've got to, write, behave, act, understand, and speak your piece at a high level because people have high expectations for the guy.
Right. There's a little pressure there, I'm sure. Yeah.
Just a little bit. Yeah. Exactly.
I'd like to think, Phil, that when I die, that Allison will look at my many boxes of notebooks and notes and be like, we need to enshrine these. We need to put them in a museum. And no, she's going to just chuck them out. Like, God damn stuff. God, these notebooks are everywhere. God, just burn them all.
Have you ever got, when you tell someone, see the Frankenstein guy? No, that's Mary Shelley.
No, occasionally, because those two written, 80, 90 years apart, still sort of part of the origins of Gothic fiction. And I will tell you, there is actually a very interesting connection to those two books. I'll keep this one short. And it's all about a volcanic eruption in Indonesia.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
When Polidori and the whole group, Shirley, and they went off to Geneva to have a summer holiday. The weather was so terrible because of the weather patterns have been changed because of this dust cloud traveling around the world. And it actually devastated parts of the world with their weather patterns. And it certainly devastated these poor guys' holiday because in Geneva, there was no sunshine. There was darkness and rain. But what it did was force this group indoors. And as a result, Mary Shelley started writing Frankenstein. Byron started writing this vampire story. He threw it down. His doctor, Polidori, he picked it up and he started writing and he finished it. Long story short, this is one of the books that got adapted onto stage. And we know that Bram Stoker was aware of that. I don't know if he bought a ticket to go watch it. I'm sure he probably did. But everything about, what's kind of cool is obviously Shelley includes a volcanic eruption in her book. And I'll tell you guys later in the show how Bram Stoker also had a volcanic eruption in his story before it was edited out.
Oh, interesting.
It was considered one of the mini ice ages that we've suffered over generations, if I recall.
Yeah.
And it definitely affected weather. It affected nations and countries. And
going back in history, could you tell us about the evolution of the vampire myth from classical to modern times?
I mean, we could be here for days if we go there, but let me do this. No, and seriously, I mean, it's so interesting that Bram, and I'll take it from his perspective at the beginning. This is where I've done all my research. Is what did Bram Stoker know about the vampire myth when he started embarking in 1890 on writing this story? And luckily, one of the coolest things is just 2 years ago. We were talking 123 years ago, this book has been written, and we're still finding mysteries. 2 years ago, I got a call from a guy in the London Library, and he found all the books that Bram used for his research. And he asked me to come over and verify. And I won't go into all the details why, but it has to do with markings in the margins that Bram made, and then books that Bram's son donated to the same library, and books that I have from the family with exactly the same markings. So it was all about kind of matching up this hieroglyphics and stuff that Bram wrote. But what we learned about this is that Bram actually said in one of these interviews, that he had been thinking about the vampire for a long time, and that it was a myth that was based on fact and fiction. Journalists writing the interview said, well, where did you get all this info from? He said, well, I found it in parts of Styria, which is Austria, China, Iceland, Germany, Saxony, Turkey, the Chersonese, Russia, Poland, Italy, France, England, and all the Tartar communities. So there was obviously a lot of superstition floating around because of these contagious diseases in the 16th, 17th, 18th century flying through Europe, because of religion and superstition and people not really understanding about biological decomposition or germ theory. The easiest thing was that superstition kind of reigned to answer the questions that people were dying to find out. And that was the darkness. This is obviously not God's will. He wouldn't have been doing this to us. There must be some other evil powers at work. And so the easiest thing that sort of permeated was a theory of the vampire. That's really what Bram found in these books. And when I say these books, these were not kind of the National Enquirer type thing. There was one book written by Reverend Charles Lee. So a priest was writing about the occult. There was a Herbert Mayo, a medical doctor, writing about vampirism and trances and somnambulism. And this was serious endeavor. And then, of course, probably the most important book was written by a Scottish lady called Emily Gerard, who a neighbor of Bram's in London, Mark Twain, actually recommended to him. And so this book was all about Transylvanian superstitions. He was basically looking at our version guides of Google and figuring out what the world was thinking of, how this stuff had gotten into our mainstream. And he's like, well, I'm going to capitalize on this. And just one other quick one. He came to America 8 times with the Lyceum Theater. And on one occasion, he picked up a newspaper called the New York World. He had cut out an article and stuck it in his Dracula notes in the Rosenbach. And it's a article all about the tuberculosis outbreak in New England, where, again, people were attributing this contagious disease without really understanding germ theory to what was natural to them. These were immigrants from years back. Their families came over to work in the timber business, work in the mining business. So they thought, once again, we've got the vampires over here as well. So Bram sort of took all this soup, let's just say, and he merged it into his one super vampire when he decided who his Count Dracula would be. So that's sort of the short version, gents, on where this whole evolution of vampire myth came from and how Bram Stoker used that to his advantage.
Quite entertained already just listening to Mr. Stoker talk about the history of the wonderful novel Dracula. You have written the first official prequel to Dracula, Dracul, co-authored with J.D. Barker, and I'll read the back. It is 1868, and a 21-year-old Bram Stoker waits in the desolate tower to face an indescribable evil. Armed only with crucifixes, holy water, and a rifle, he prays to survive a single night, the longest of his life. Desperate to record what he has witnessed, Bram scribbles down the events that led him here. It's a prequel to Dracula, which is considered one of the oldest and most celebrated horror novels in the history of literature. So how did you prepare to write this prequel you're going to have tons and tons of fans judging you by this book. It's like when Star Trek puts out another series after Next Gen, and you've got all these fans that have Star Trek a certain way, and if you change that mythology a little bit, they'll tear down your studio. So how did you write this prequel? How did you research it that you knew would prove worthy by the horror fans around the world, and what was that process like?
That's a great question, because once I rebuilt the studio after some fan reaction to Dracula the Undead, that sequel, which when we wrote that one, we didn't use the epistolary style. We took some liberties. We sort of followed along with what movies were doing. The 19 Coppola was one of our favorite movies, Ian and I. And so when we got to do Dracul, my first thought, and there was a long time frame in between. This was between 2009 and 2018 when Dracul came out. This idea had been in my mind, but it was definitely going to be, all right, I've heard people, some love the story, some absolutely hate it because we did change things. We're going to go back to the original style. We're going to go epistolary, and I'm going to make sure I get a chance to tell Bram's story. But this is what was in my mind. What if the story was real? And what authors do from time to time, and we always talk about the what if. And I actually I'd found that Richard Dalby, a British researcher, actually found the original preface to Dracula. It's still debatable exactly how this came to be, but it made its way to Sweden and then Iceland, and it was sitting in an Icelandic edition of Dracula until a friend of mine, Hans de Roos, found the whole story. But Dalby actually translated the preface in 1989. And when I found it, and it said, I'm quite convinced there's no doubt whatever that the events here described really took place, however unbelievable and incomprehensible they might appear at first sight, I am further convinced they must always remain to some extent incomprehensible. And it goes on and on to convince the reader the story is real. So I thought, okay, let's go with this for a minute. And I took the real events in Bram Stoker's life, because I had to do that at this stage, to make sure that this was beyond reproach. Bram was very sick for the first 7 years of his life. He made a miraculous recovery. Nobody knows really what his sickness was or how he recovered to become a champion athlete. Now, my background in teaching and then coaching all the way to the Olympic level, I thought, here's the opening, his miraculous recovery. In my day, in the 80s and 90s coaching, you see steroids and blood doping and human growth hormone. What happens if Bram Stoker had some sort of supernatural intervention that's going to make him recover? And then, as we all know, you got to pay the piper later on, and the vampires come knocking. And Bram Stoker has to then tell the world somehow. Now, if he went up to Scotland Yard or the Metropolitan Police and said, guys, I got proof there's vampires here, they probably would have wrapped him up and thrown him in an asylum. But instead, he does what Bram Stoker would have done naturally, is write a book, and with this sort of undertones that vampires are real. Now, so that's the basis for the story. And the second thing is finding a really good co-author, J.D. Barther, who's very good at writing thriller mystery stuff. So really that idea of me finding all these important things in Bram's life that we could then fictionalize, and just like Bram did in Dracula, blur the edges, make sure that the reader on edge that, this really happened? Did it not happen? Did he really have a nanny? Did his sister really do this? Was Arminius Vanbury really this guy? So all the research that I had been doing came back to sort of play and just insert this fictionally. And as we say, the rest is finally some really good reviews. And I think we won over a lot of hardcore Dracula fans.
Reading the reviews on both books over at Goodreads, I noticed the one had a lot of problems with fans, but this one was 5 stars all the way.
And I get it. I didn't get it at the beginning. And the same thing happens a bit with movies. There are faithful adaptations of Dracula that people, the movie's okay, and it's faithful to Dracula. The latest BBC Netflix co-pro came out. It was a good movie, but it wasn't faithful to Dracula. And people killed it because it wasn't faithful to Dracula. And yet the writers who I met in Ireland at the Bram Stoker Festival said, look, BBC's already done a faithful adaptation of Dracula. We're now going to have a reimagined version. But people still hated it because, it wasn't. And so you're treading on hallowed ground, as I really understand. This is Bram Stoker faithful fans. Some people read this book once a year faithfully and for their life. And it's incredible. And so that's really what prompted J.D. Barker and I to get back to basics, really do our homework. J.D. put on his headphones and he walked for a month listening to over and over to Dracula being read so we could get into the cadence of Bram's writing. And I'm so glad that we finally did get the proper accolade for all the hard work that went into it. And I'm proud, and I think Bram would have been proud too.
Well, we're proud.
I don't read it every year, but I read it at least every few years, I would say. And ironically, I don't read it during Halloween season. I read it in the dead of winter. Any given year that I read it, like January, February. For me personally, I just feel that like winter time, that just cold, dreary setting just kind of worked for that. It's the same thing with Misery. I always watch Misery in like January for some reason, because of the snow and Fargo and all that.
Well, we're talking to Dacre Stoker on episode 150, Vampire Lore with Dacre Stoker, on What Are You Afraid of? Horror and Paranormal Show. We're on ParaX Radio, Friday nights, 9 p.m. Eastern Time. Check out our website at www.whatayouafraidofpodcast.com for a page on this episode where you'll find links to Dacre Stoker's work, plus a page for every episode, plus my constantly expanding catalog of ghost stories that you can either read the story or listen to our voice actors, and many more to put on there, and I'm very excited I'm finally getting that done. We have an excerpt from Dracul, read by our beloved English folk singer, David Walton, who's been with us from the start. He's narrated most of those ghost stories on the website. He just has such a wonderful cadence and voice. Plus, he has a website where you can download the spooky music that he's done for the show on Bandcamp, and you can find links for that at the website at www.whatayouafraidofpodcast.com. We'll be right back with Dacre Stoker on episode 150. This is David Walton reading an excerpt from Dracul.
This is Katrina Weidman of Destination America.
This is Joan Lansdale, creator of the Hap and Leonard series.
This is actor and filmmaker Steve Monarch from Friday the 13th, the series.
This is Heather Taddy from Paranormal State and Alien Highway.
This is Chuck Zukowski from Travel Channel's show Alien Highway.
This is Dacre Stoker, great-grandnephew of Bram Stoker and author of Dracul.
This is Michelle Belanger from Portals to Hell.
And you are listening to Ghost Stories and Horror with T. Fox Dunham and Phil Thomas.
With the T. Fox Dunham and Phil Thomas.
Fox and Phil.
Billy and Fox.
What are you afraid of?
What are you afraid of?
What are you afraid of?
What are you afraid of? Horror and paranormal show.
What are you afraid of?
There'd be no Philadelphia without Uncle Lloyd.
Excerpt from Chapter 1 of Dracul by Dacre Stoker and J.D. Barker. Read by David Walton. The Journal of Bram Stoker. The peculiarities of Helen Crone. That is, of course, where I should start, for this is as much her story as it is mine, perhaps more so. This woman, this monster, this wraith, this friend, this being. She was always there for us. My sisters and brothers would tell you as much. But there for us, how, is where most inquiries should lay. The root of the beast, if you will. She was there at my beginning, and will no doubt be there for my end, as I was for hers. This was, and always shall be, our dance. My lovely Nana Ellen, a hand always reaching out, even as the prick of her nails drew blood. My beginning, what a horrid affair it was. From my earliest memories I was a sickly child, bedridden and ill, from my birth in 1847 until my 7th year, when a cure befell upon me that would change my life for every year thereafter until this very day. I will speak of this cure in great length to come, but for now it is important you understand the state in which I spent those early years. Where to start? There is so much to tell and precious little time. The October of 1854 is when all things changed, over the course of days, in fact. By the time this particular week came to a close, a family would be dead. I would be healed, and our dear Nana Ellen would be gone. It started innocently enough, a little eavesdropping, a picture of my near demise. We were but children, I 7 and Matilda 8. This fall season, never to be forgotten, began with only 2 words. October 1854. Buried alive, Matilda said again, her voice low and sombre. That's what she said. I heard her true, I am sure of that. I was closest to Matilda. Although she was 1 year older than I spent many of my waking hours in Matilda's company, particularly on the days in which I found myself confined to my room, which numbered many, today being such a day. We were standing at my window, and Matilda was pointing towards the harbour. Marsh said the man was diseased, and when he pled for help, the men who answered only dug a hole in the earth and pushed him in. What type of person does it take to do such a thing? How could others participate in good conscience? Ma said no such thing, I told her, following her finger, my eyes attempting to see through the rolling fog of the water. She did, but if you were to ask her about it, I am sure she would deny ever speaking the words. But she told Pa when he returned home from work not more than 20 minutes ago, I came to you straight away. I tried not to smile, for I knew Matilda only spun such a tale in order to boost my spirits, but the corners of my mouth rose nonetheless, and she smacked me on my shoulder. Now you're mocking me. She frowned, turning from the window. Where did you say this happened? She didn't answer, staring only at the far wall. Matilda, where did this occur? With a deep sigh, she returned her gaze to the window, at the cemetery behind St. John the Baptist Church. She said they buried him amongst the suicide graves. Suicide graves? Matilda rolled her eyes. I've told you about them before. They're hidden at the far east end of the cemetery, just beyond the cemetery wall, in constant shade of the sun. Anyone who takes their own life is buried there. They also bury thieves and criminals and the like there too. There are few markers or crypts, mostly raw earth covering hundreds of graves. It's not consecrated either. Those buried there will never know peace. They spend eternity damned.
I am horror author T. Fox Dunham.
And I am author and filmmaker Phil Thomas.
And we are going to save Halloween 2020.
This Halloween, our community has changed due to the danger of COVID-19.
We must make sacrifices to protect ourselves, our loved ones, and each other, especially the senior and vulnerable members of our community.
But this doesn't mean we cancel Halloween. In fact, we need to celebrate Halloween as a distraction, an expression of our fears, to give ourselves and our children a sense of normalcy.
So this Halloween, we ask that you find alternatives to trick-or-treating, respect social distancing at public events, wear masks below masks, and wash your hands.
Serial killers and monsters, please maintain a distance of 6 feet when chasing happy teenagers at campgrounds or in abandoned factories.
And don't give up. Find new ways of performing beloved traditions like trick-or-treating on Skype, or enjoying your favorite horror films with friends through an online watching party, or when summoning demonic spirits, make sure the hell dimension you are summoning from has observed COVID-19 prevention guidelines, such as social distancing during cult ceremonies.
This is
Fox, and we wish you a safe and non-contagious Halloween.
You've no doubt heard of Tango and Cash, Whiskey Tango Foxtrot. Perhaps it takes two to tango. Well, now, on the first and third Thursdays of each month, there's a show called Tango and Friends at 8 p.m. Eastern on the Para X Radio Network with your host, Bruce Tango. And yes, there will be at least two to tango on each episode, sometimes even more. There's going to be lots of topics and lots of guests you'll all know and lots of surprises. Tango and Friends every first and third Thursday of the month at 8 p.m. right here on the Para X Radio Network.
We're back on episode 150, Vampire Lore, with Dacre Stoker. This is What Are You Afraid Of? Horror and Paranormal Show. So, Phil, did you know that I am descended from a vampire?
I did not know that.
It's sort of legend and rumor. He was also said to be an occultist or a warlock. My family descends from Sir Francis Stewart, the Earl of Bothwell. He was the cad who kidnapped Mary, Queen of Scots, after they killed her husband, forced him to marry her, and then she fled south, where she was taken prisoner by Queen Elizabeth I, her cousin, and Bothwell had to escape. I'm a Hume, descendant of the Stuarts, the royal line, and he fled, but it was said that he was a dark witch, working dark magic on the monarchy of England, but it was also said that he was a vampire. At least these things were said to discredit him. He was none of these things. He was just an ambitious bloke who got in over his head. But we are back talking to Dacre Stoker on episode 150.
I wanted to ask Dacre if he heard of, did you ever hear of a novel called Opium and Absinthe?
No, I haven't.
It's by Lydia Kang. It's fairly new. I actually have it right here. I'm going to read you the back. New York City, 1899. Tilly Pembroke's sister lies dead, her body drained of blood, and with 2 puncture wounds on her neck. Bram Stoker's new novel, Dracula, has just been published, and Tilly's imagination leaps to the impossible. The murderer is a vampire. But it can't be, can it?
We're interviewing her next week.
I haven't read it yet, and I should probably read it before she comes on. I bought it a few weeks ago, but I was finishing up a couple other things. I should get to it, though, soon.
Right.
So creatures with vampire characteristics have been drinking blood in ancient Greek myth, and vampires were blamed for disease in the medieval era. So for centuries, they have been used as symbols to represent disease, premature burial, ideas against Christianity, and even sexuality. As symbols, what do vampires represent today in our modern culture?
Well, you've got to put it in perspective, obviously. Back in the 16th and 17th century, people didn't understand, as I said earlier in the show, the science, and they didn't understand germ theory and biological decomposition. So what they represented back then was this sort of dark unknown, this this thing that the sun goes down, anything evil is attributed to the superstition. And also, it was a very helpful tool, because what parents could do, elders in towns, was they sort of use this as a cautionary tale. It's like the boogeyman. If you do this, you're going to turn a vampire. If you don't go to church on a Sunday, if this girl runs off with this dark guy who comes back into the town from fighting in wars, and he's going to take you away, well, now we lose all the young girls in the town, so he's going to be a vampire. So those days was whole issue of evil deeds. Could they be explained, and trying to make understanding? And superstition was kind of up there with religion. And those battles still go on. Today, when you look at the role of religion, witchcraft, magic, and vampires, and this falls right in there. We are a little more educated than back in the day, so we have to look at pure entertainment. And nowadays, that's really, to me, where the vampire falls in. But it goes a little bit farther than that, because there is this connection to something that, no matter how educated we are, people still wonder about life after death. And now, even as enlightened as we are, we just wonder if there's that chance that something could be there that we don't know about, or there is a possibility for coming back to life. Who knows? Mary Shelley touched on that with Frankenstein, and in a way, Bram did the same thing. The blood is the life. Well, can you reintroduce blood to a dead person? Well, nowadays we've got cloning, we've got CPR, we've got all these cryosurgery, we've got all these other things we're thinking about, and yet still the vampire in literature and television and movies is just always hovering there as something that is, it's still pretty cool. What does it symbolize now? Different? It really hasn't changed too much, just the playing field has changed.
And one day, if they actually cure the common death, horror writers are going to be out of a job. We're going to lose it. That'll be it. And I hope so. Going back into history, and I know I just talked about my relative Francis Stewart, the Earl of Bothwell. In 1597, King James wrote a dissertation on witchcraft titled The Demonology. And I love that recent episode of Doctor Who, where you had King James running around as the witch finder general. And of course he meets the doctor and her staff. And he wrote that the belief that demons could possess both the living and the dead. So you've got this wonderful lore of vampires, and you've got blood-sucking creatures going all the way back to the Greeks. You've got the Stagori, demons, you've got ghouls and wraiths. And then Christianity comes along, and it definitely influences the Dracula story, and it sort of becomes bonded to all these Christian symbols and ideals. And of course, that's what they did to pagan folklore and Irish folklore. They started pushing in these Christian concepts into the folklore and turning ancient springs into sainted wells. How did Christianity influence vampire lore?
Well, he was trying to, sort of formalize the approach to educate people about life and death and how to behave properly. It's a control factor, and how to be good. And if so, you will be able to rest in peace and have a good afterlife, whatever that may be. Vampirism on the other side was sort of, again, I don't want to repeat myself, but is this great fear of the unknown. And for those people who don't necessarily believe in the form of religions that fall under Christianity and all the rituals that go with it, there's a heck of a lot of people back in the day, and still to these days, in places where Bram circulated, coming from Ireland with very rich folklore in all kinds of pagan rituals. And we also know he wrote the book when he was in Cruden Bay, Scotland, for 13 different summers. And I think over the 3 summers that he there wrote the book, he was heavily influenced by their pagan rituals as well. So, that struggle back and forth between formality of a religion and the control factor, and yet that kind of freedom that comes with free thought. And Bram was a Freemason. That's a very seldom known fact, but I found proof of that. He was a free thinker, and he couldn't, I don't think he could really freely exercise as others could his ability to convey some of those thoughts, because he was a very conservative, upstanding theater manager for Henry Irving. So he couldn't be an edgy guy, but he could certainly write about it. But what he still did, if you think about Dracula for a moment, you still have this belief that he's trying to set out this understanding that you've got to believe in things you know to be untrue. And that's actually a line he borrowed from Mark Twain. You must believe in what? Believe in things you know to be untrue. And I think what he's saying there is, whatever religion you believe in, it's a good thing. You just got to have faith, because faith is going to win out over the dark side. And that's really the whole understanding of this book. In 2012, I was asked by the priest who was leading the procession in the same church that Bram was married in, Dacre, have you got a copy of Dracula? We'd like to process with it. And I was with my son, who was a religious major at Sewanee. He goes, Dad, that's not such a good idea. They wanted to process up the church, a packed house, with the Bible held by one guy and Dracula with the other. And so we produced a first edition. And he turned to me and said, what's the matter? They're both books the same. They're all about good and evil, where good wins out at the end. And my son turned to me and says, well, I got to take that back to my professors.
What a great church.
So guys, that's that's a long-winded thing about, the struggle. But I'll tell you, as you both well know, that struggle still goes on. People are still trying to wrestle with the role of religion, understanding of where we are, and superstitions are not going anywhere. They are still very strong in determining our thoughts, our words, and our deeds.
I wonder where religion will be when we actually cure the common death. We see a lot of religious iconography in the books, and of course in the follow-up Dracula movies and vampire movies, where you hold a crucifix or use holy water to banish. In fact, in D&D now, it's called turning the undead, and all you need is a holy symbol. And I think the theory has evolved that it's not just Christian iconography, it's your faith in something bigger than yourself. It's something that sort of pushes the vampire away, because it's no longer in God's sight and God's light and whatever you believe to be God, that it's your individual faith that pushes them away. And I'm thinking about it, if I had the choice between being a vampire or being mortal, I'd probably go with mortal, unless I could be Angel, the vampire with the soul from Buffy.
Yeah. It's Angel season for you, right?
Oh, I'm watching Angel. I've got the last 2 episodes where he's at Wolfram Hart, and I haven't watched them yet because I'm saving them.
You're saving them.
Yes,
nice. Perfect. Did you get to What We Do in the Shadows yet?
Oh, yes. Allison and I finished that. My wife, it's been so odd this year. For years, she didn't care for Halloween. It bothered her. But then we got the new apartment in Lancaster. And of course, we're shut down by COVID, and now she loves Halloween. We're decorating. Wow. She's looking for scary things to watch. She watched all of season 1 of What We Do in the Shadows, and then 2. And now she's doing things like yelling, "Bat!" like Matt Berry does, and turns into a bat.
Nice. Bat. That's awesome. I find this to be very interesting, because several books and poems were written in the 19th century, including John Stagg's The Vampire or John Polidori's The Vampire from 1819. So why do you think that these works are generally forgotten while your uncle's book is celebrated as the greatest vampire novel of all time?
Well, obviously, Bram had a much better publicist.
It's all about the publicist.
It is, as you guys know. No, he didn't have podcasts. He didn't have TV. He didn't have social media. But seriously, that's a question many of us chat about. Bram does not, and he should not get credit for inventing this thing in literature. It was Polidori wrote the first book, and then Reimer wrote Varney the Vampire, and then Le Fanu, Carmilla, and then along comes Bram. But there had been other plays as well prior to that. Polidori's Vampire became a stage play. And so what is it that Bram did? And I think there's elements. I don't have the absolute answer, but I'll tell you some of my thoughts is that because he set his story in this sort of, far off country, but not so far away that it was untouchable. Back in the day, the civilized world really sort of ended at Budapest, and at least for the British, okay? And they didn't know much about Transylvania, Romania, Moldavia, Wallachia, but there were some adventurers that went there. And Bram was lucky enough to read the books that they wrote and pored over the maps that they drew. This is Bonner, Cross, Macchiarelli, James Samuelson, William Wilkinson, all these guys that did give back some information. So it was there, but what Bram did was he connected to a symbol, which was the devil, and then he applied that to Vlad Dracula, who was a real guy with a somewhat known history, not much, who was a devil himself and was referenced in books as the devil. He wasn't a blood drinker, but his behavior, his activities were the devil. And when that guy actually arrived onto the shores, which originally were going to be Dover, but because of the holiday Bram took, became Whitby, in a real place where a lot of holiday goers from London went, this story suddenly became real, and it really touched the nerve of the sense and sensibilities of Victorians who were quite comfortable in the leading intelligentsia of the world were in London. It was the economic center of the world. It was theatrical center of the world. But along comes this guy on the heels of Jack the Ripper, who was just peaked just when Bram started to write this, scared the bejesus out of people that along comes this now supernatural thing that's going to upset our comfortable lifestyle, upset our world. And Bram hit it just right with making the story take place, as I said, Whitby, London, Hampstead Heath, Purfleet, all the places that these folks would go and make them look over their shoulders. And that, to me, is why the story sort of resonated then and obviously picked up momentum. And we've got to give a lot of credit, obviously, to when the story was adapted onto stage. That was a milestone when his wife tried to get it turned into a stage play first. With Charles Morel, it didn't work, but then she worked with Hamilton Dean and later Balderston, and along comes Bela Lugosi after a run in England. And as we say, the rest is history. You now have this identifiable aristocrat, handsome, suave, debonair guy that's charming people in the theaters and movies and Christopher Lee and on and on. Bram really benefits from that. He didn't have a whole lot to do with how his story proliferated in all those other years. It's just that writers, directors, producers realized this was a good book to adapt. And then one thing sort of led to another, more book sales because of these, the book's more popular. Oh, no, let's have a version of the movie. So there was some luck involved. There was some fate. People stick to a certain extent, they follow his rules. They do change a lot in movies, merge characters and places. But I think that's why he's got the leg up on those original stories. Although there is a Carmilla coming out now, I think.
We are talking to Bram Stoker on episode 150, Vampire Lore.
We're not talking to Bram Stoker.
I know, I was going to say.
Oh, okay, I'm sorry.
I think I have it now. We are talking to Bram Stoker. I believe that Bram Stoker got himself turned into a vampire, and he has been pretending to be his own descendants. I think we're on to you, Dacre.
Gosh, I thought I had this gig going pretty good for a while, and you guys found me.
Aha.
Just blew the lid off of it.
Well, my name is T. Fox Dunham Von Helsing. I'm coming after you now.
Oh, no. Uh-oh.
But again, we're on episode 150, Vampire Lore, with Dacre Stoker on What Are You Afraid Of? We're on Parix Radio, Friday nights at 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Check out our website at www.whatayouafraidofpodcast.com for more information about this episode, all of our previous 149 episodes. Plus, check out our Halloween shows. We've had some wonderful guests on, like Daniel Kraus, who finished the book for George Romero. We had Lisa Morton, the previous president of the Horror Writers Association, on her book about seances. That was really wonderful. And of course, we give tips for celebrating Halloween and being safe for COVID. Make sure to protect each other out there. So, we're going to play a short fiction that was written by a good friend of mine, Deborah Drake, and she's one of those authors out there who should be famous. Her writing should be everywhere, but she's brilliant and a good writer, but she has no idea how to really break into the industry or have her writing known. So I wanted to get this story up that she did up here. This is called The Vampire's First Rule. It's a piece of flash fiction written by Deborah Drake. And we'll be right back on What You're Afraid of, Horror and Paranormal Show, episode 150, Vampire Lore, with Dacre Stoker, celebrating Halloween 2020. This is Vampire's First Rule by Deborah Drake. The Vampire's First Rule by Deborah Drake. Read by T. Fox Dunham and Cindy Hermann. Sunset left streaks of violet clouds across a horizon studded with the tiny lights of Torrensburg. Mealy watched Paul from bushes nearby, armed with what she needed, her wavy black hair tightly tied back. Her back was turned to those lights. Small, human lives. Paul approached the Paradise Cavern's entrance, hidden in the hills outside the city, for the monthly blood offering to the Eternal Half-Lighter, who, according to regional vampire beliefs, hibernated in the unexplored back end of these caves sustained by the offerings of the Cavern Guardian. Mealy knew all about these caverns, acquired by the vampire community long ago, to ensure privacy with no trespassing after local settlers started exploring the hills. She saw Paul drink silently from the willing human donor, laid out on the grassy shale. After having his fill, he sent the woman back down to her car. With a blood-filled mouth, he approached the cavern entrance. Millie mouthed with him the old-world vampire blessing he would be reciting mentally as he leaned forward.
O Ma, beloved of the 9 half-lighters, may the feather never find its rest this night, as we hold the symmetry of its scales. As the Shi'at is reborn, so we rest each day. As the Shi'at partakes of the vital nectar drawn into this eternal heart, so we are granted immortality.
Blood trickled from his parted lips and into the bowl hollowed from a pale block of stone as tall as his waist. The bowl had a central opening where the blood filtered down. Mealy aimed the spear and prepared to strike. He must have sensed it and tensed up, perhaps hearing the faint rustle of dried leaves on the ground. Before he could act, she sliced open his back with her spear, forcing him forward. He gripped the edges of the bowl firmly enough to protect his head, pushed away from it, and twisted around to see the other attacker before he crumpled to the cave floor. He couldn't have expected to see Mealy. After his last attack, she made him believe she was out of commission for good. Mealy had hidden, allowing her wounds to heal. Her thoughts never strayed from their next confrontation. His energy reserves drained, and he trembled. She sensed the rage burning through him like a scalding syrup as he crawled backward into the cave. 3 feet of the spear extended through him and dragged along, with each move pushing the spear in deeper. He stood and charged backwards against the rocky wall to shove the spear back through the wound enough to pull it from the front. Crimson saturated his eyes from his iris to sclera. He grabbed the spear and tugged it with all his strength until it pulled free of the wound. His mouth wrenched open in a howl of agony. Mealy followed him in with a machete in her hand and a leather pouch fastened to her belt loop. He recognized the stink of decomposition and soil coming from the pouch as their burial grounds from the old world.
You risk offending a half-lighter during an offering just to destroy me and steal my position?
He scurried from the damp wall to a spot near the entrance, still moving slowly, always with eyes on Mealy.
What a worthless lump of dirt, not fit to be scoffed off my shoe.
She closed on him and replied,
I'm meant to be the guardian of this sanctuary. You don't get to do what you like when it comes to this sanctuary, this city, or me. You started this a long time ago.
He grabbed at the leather pouch and he yanked it open in order to slow her and give him time to recuperate enough to think clearly. Dirt fell in clumps onto the floor of the cave.
And I've had more than enough,
she added and moved forward. She looked down at the dirt and her eyes glazed over, deep in the memories of the sliced limbs and bone-deep wounds traded over the centuries of this dispute of being hurt in more ways than one of the repetitive accusations. She swung the machete with impeccable aim and ripped his throat open. Then she swung again, slicing completely through his neck. Paul's head separated from his body and rolled to her boot. She stared down at his face. Her mouth opened in a silent gasp with nothing to say, no final words for him. Mealy hadn't actually expected to succeed. She gathered the clumps of native soil, crouched down, then jammed the dirt into his mouth, stuffing it against the roof of his mouth and tongue, leaving no room. The homeland soil filling his mouth sealed his fate. With Paul's death, her fury faded. Her own eternity on Earth never troubled her so much, but the thought that he was gone forever by her hand devastated her. Her nerves were on edge, and she shivered. She had broken the first law of the Eternal Half-Lighters.
Vampire cannot destroy fellow vampire.
Mealy kept looking down at Paul, overwhelmed by a deepening remorse, but also an urgent need to clean up the mess, to be rid of Paul, and all the combined memories summoned by the sight of him. The cave exhaled colder breath. Then came a different sound Mealy had not heard in over a century. It drifted up from the lowest caverns, the susurrus so gentle in lament. It rose as a melodic undertone in words from an unfamiliar age and place, reminding her of what she feared to see ascend a second time from the back cavern. Only the gods below could help her if the half-lighter had wakened fully. She had acted in the heat of the moment in vengeance, and it would not be enough to justify decapitating the vampire next to her. Paul's eyes looked up at her from where she had left his head on the ground. Had they been open? She couldn't remember, but she knew he hadn't spoken those ancient words. The voice was an unmistakable part of the half-lighter torment that had once almost destroyed her. She didn't know whether to run and keep running out of the state, or face the broken entryway to the lower caverns with her dead rival lying next to her. She turned to flee the caves, but a voice interrupted her.
Let me go.
She recognized the voice, though it should have been impossible. He had just died in front of her. She turned, sickened to see but needing to know. Paul stood as if propped up by invisible arms, his head reattached, the hole in his chest sealed in a ragged scar, the soil from inside his mouth in a small pile near his feet, a marionette of a dead vampire animated to torment her. Is that what he was?
Is the half-lighter doing this?
She asked, scared of the answer.
Melly, let me go, please. You tried your best to kill me. You succeeded. I can't have this happen again and again. Stop holding me here,
he pleaded.
Just send me back into nothingness. Look at me.
His voice broke as if sobbing without tears. He shook his head as he looked at her.
Oh, Paul. I don't think I'm doing this at all. It can't be. I don't have such power.
She walked to him and rested her hands on his shoulders.
I am so sorry. I didn't want you to die. Not really. I thought I did it until it was over.
If it isn't you, then who?
I don't know, but Paul, you're healing. I don't understand it, but I'm relieved.
She was surprised at her own admission, but she really did feel relief.
If I am healing on my own, then that rule one must not be broken about behavior. Maybe it's impossible for us to kill each other. Can you see us healing from death repeatedly, endlessly?
Melly gripped his shoulders tighter.
I don't know about you, but I don't think I can watch you die again by my hand. Let's just tend to the guardianship together. I think our eternal half-lighter may want it that way. Yes?
She felt a tingling presence and stared at the rubble at the back of the cave. Pinpoint scarlet embers swirled with a translucent mist that curled and dissipated between the rocks at the back of the cave. A breeze carried out a lilting sigh through the caverns as Millie helped Paul down the hill.
We drink the blood of virgins and get drunk in the park. We always pass out dead. We are creatures of the dark. And every single night we raise it from the mire. We're not only lovers, but bloodthirsty vampires. And we're always dancing in the moonlight, with blood on our lips and predatory eyes. Our skin's pale, white, and nails like knives. In the city's darkened alleys is where our passion thrives. And of course, we wear all black and visit local haunts. We howl with the wolves. We do exactly what we want. And when the bars close at 2 a.m., you know that's when the real fun begins. And we're always dancing in the moonlight, with blood on our lips and predatory eyes. Oh, skin pale white and nails like knives. We're fucking in the graveyard, leaving bite marks on my thighs.
Mercy, a new horror medical thriller from author T. Fox Dunham, published by Bloodbound Books. Based on the author's horrific battle with a rare form of lymphoma that involved intense chemotherapy and radiation, Fox turns the horror of his experience into terror on the page.
William Saint is dying of cancer. On most days, death seems like a humane alternative to the treatment. Stricken with fever, William is rushed to Mercy, notorious as a place to send the sickest of the poor and uninsured to be forgotten, and finds the hospital in even worse condition than his previous visit. The grounds are unkempt, the foundation is cracking, and like the wild mushrooms sprouting from the fissures of decay around it, something is growing inside the hospital. Something dark.
Fangoria gives Mercy 3.5 out of 4 skulls. Dunham has channeled his many brushes with the other side into the exquisitely rendered, lyrical, supernatural hospital thriller Mercy.
It's feeding on the sickness and sustaining itself on the staff, changing them, and now it wants Willie.
Available from Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and bookstores everywhere in both print and digital versions.
Life is an addiction.
Let go. Let it all burn.
La bombe.
rest van de wereld.
Dead Zone WDZRTV.
Where metal and the paranormal collide.
Your source for everything paranormal, Para-X.
Hello folks. I've uploaded a compilation of 10 songs with a ghostly theme that have been specifically recorded for various episodes of What Are You Afraid Of podcast.com. Go to Bandcamp and search for Brendan Shawland. The album is called The Ghostly Brendan Shawland. You can listen to them for free or download them for a modest fee as a complete album or as individual songs. Thank you.
Halloween is upon us, and we are back on episode 150, Vampire Lore, with Dacre Stoker. So, Phil, right around this time of year, I sort of go onto Amazon.com, and I look for indie horror films, mostly zombie films.
Right.
To see if I can find something new in this old trope that just won't stay dead, even though I love zombie films. You know, I'll be taking out all my George Romero classics.
It won't stay dead, no pun intended.
No, all pun intended when it
all
comes to me.
All pun intended, there you go.
So I watched one earlier today as I was getting ready for the interview. It was called I Am Alone. It stars Gareth David Lloyd, who was in Doctor Who. He was in Torchwood and various shows like that as a Yondu, great actor. And it's about a survivalist who's out making films called I Am Alone, Surviving in the Rocky Mountains. And while he's doing this, a zombie apocalypse takes place in the background. It was low budget. You can obviously tell there was like a couple of guys running around with a script, but
right.
It was actually quite a bit of fun.
That sounds pretty interesting. And where did you watch this on? What platform?
Amazon Prime.
Oh, it's on Amazon. Okay.
Yeah, you'll be able to go over and find it on Amazon Prime. It's called I Am Alone. And, but, you know, I watch these shows and I look for this stuff that's not out in general consumption. And you can find a lot of gems made by indie directors who are much like indie authors like we are, who are out there continuing to push the envelope of the genre, even with smaller budgets. But it's a lot of fun. And like I said, if you're listening, go check out I Am Alone. And it was actually a very interesting movie. But we are back on episode 150, Vampire Lore, with Dacre Stokers. That song was Mom Jean's AO3 Vampire. I played it with our Creative Commons shared
Mom
license.
Jeans.
Mom Jeans, yeah.
I love that. Actually, both of you really should check out Haunt.
Mm-hmm.
I can't endorse that enough. I was very taken aback by how well crafted it was. I wasn't expecting it. I thought it might be good, but my expectations weren't too high, though. Wonderful setup. Perfect Halloween movie, because the whole thing takes place on Halloween.
Right.
The whole movie.
Yeah, that's on Shudder, right?
It's on Shudder, correct, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Produced by Eli Roth.
Mm-hmm.
And it's from, I think, some of the writers that did A Quiet Place.
Oh.
Yeah.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
That sounds really cool. So we're talking with Dacre Stoker on episode 150. Looking at the genre, and especially watching shows like Buffy the Vampire Slayer and Angel, My Angel, the Vampire with a Soul, and it's always young adults around the age of 20, half-dressed, running around. And the moment they get a little older, they kick them off the show and bring in someone else who's young. And,
right.
Joss Whedon definitely had a thing for that. So going back, vampires are definitely connected to eroticism. And I was reading things like in Dracula, where they have vampires biting at the wrist or drinking blood in various parts of the body. It was really a cover for erotic elements in the story. So, Mr. Stoker, why are vampires so sexy to modern audiences?
Nowadays, the censors are a lot more forgiving. Back in the day, as you well pointed out, for Bram Stoker to describe, Lucy or Mina, tilting her head back, exposing her neck, and Dracula slowly moving in, and this fluid exchange is just nowadays like watching an episode of True Blood or Vampire Diaries, where people are going at it full frontal and everything. So it's just really sort of a continuum of pressing the edge of the envelope with the whole idea of that the sexuality element. Obviously, you did used to see just sort of male female. Now it's everything. It's male male, female female. Almost like everything goes in a vampire movie. But here's to me, I think, the most important thing. And a good friend of mine, Professor John Edgar Browning, who wrote a book called Vampire and Visual Media, did sort of the study of how vampire movies post Christopher Lee, so after the Hammer stuff, sort of went through this lull, because those were the days when the censors allowed Christopher Lee to have fangs and blood and just limited cleavage. So we had Pitt and Carolyn Monroe and the others that were allowed to show something. But once the censors allowed more skin in regular movies, the vampire movie stopped being the one movie you'd go see if you wanted to see some skin. So the vampire movies had to stand on their own as really good movies. And that's when, Anne Rice came out with her story, Interview. Vampire was turned into a movie, and Stephen King's Salem's Lot, and the 92 Coppola. All these had to be just a darn good movie, not just an opportunity to go and get excited for skin. But nonetheless, I think the one basic thing that remains, old days or new days when we're allowed to see all sorts of things, is the power that the vampire, whoever that vampire is, has over its prey. It's not just animalistic, jump on somebody and get them. There is this seduction involved, and there is this hypnotism involved, and there is this charmingness involved that is quite appealing. And I'm not saying there aren't vampire movies where the vampire just turns around the corner and rips somebody's head off. But to me, the ones that are more interesting are the ones that have that element that creeps me out, when the victim loses control, cannot just run away or get in the car and drive away or pick up a crucifix, that there is some power that this vampire has that you just can't escape. And to me, that power mixed with sexuality is very, very strong.
Mm-hmm. So back to your writing, if you could send an email back in time to yourself, back when you first started writing, what would you tell yourself?
I got to say, that's the first time I've ever been asked that, and it made me really think. Because, there are a lot of things I would have said, and I think I've already mentioned it once in the show. For God's sake, pay more attention when you write Dracula the Undead with Ian Holt to, what do the faithful Dracula fans want? And number one is, make an epistolary style written novel. And number two, maybe think twice about the type of Dracula who your main character is portraying. And obviously we decided to sort of upgrade or update Bram's character to a more Gary Oldman 92 Coppola style. And I look at that now, guys, and I go, boy, that was an opportunity lost maybe, because people have loved that in Dracul, to go back to basics. And this friend of mine in Mexico, who's a graphic designer, Enrique Palafox, we're having a lot of fun going back to, retro Dracula. Let's go back to Bram's guy, who is not all that attractive. He's not the charming Bela Lugosi, Christopher Lee. He's the guy with the gnarly face and the hairy palms, the smelly breath. That's the guy maybe I should have used. And so that probably would have been the basis for that email.
Excellent. Okay. That's something we ask every author when we get them on.
That's a good question.
What did you know now that you wish you could tell yourself then? And everybody's always has some very good answers for that. And we support a lot of new authors, a lot of indie authors and filmmakers, and it's like, come listen to the show to hear the advice these authors give. And a lot of it is about writing well, but a lot of it is also about being at the right place at the right time, or even having the right family last name that I'm sure helped you legitimize the book. So our friend Bill Gill, he's a contributor to the show. He's written a few interviews for us. He's probably sitting at Barnes & Noble right now, excited over in fact, I've been texting him to see what he thinks. Now, he loves the movies. He loves vampires. He gave us a list of his top 4 favorite movies, and number 4 was Bram Stoker's Dracula, 1992, with Gary Oldman, which was incredible except for Keanu Reeves trying to do a British accent, that kind of... It's like, oh, it's Dracula, dude, So you had 3 Dracula.
It's funny because I actually don't... so many people have a problem with Keanu Reeves. I actually don't. I mean, I don't mind him. I don't know.
I like him, but it's just the accent sometimes.
I know, and he's entertaining in that aspect, though.
True,
in a way. But
so number 3, on his list is Dracula, 1974, with Jack Palance as the Count. Number 2, Dracula, Christopher Lee, who's also squaring off with Peter Cushing. Peter Cushing's wonderful and everything. And then he loves, and you mentioned this, the BBC version starring Lewis Jordan from 1978. Sounds like that's the iconic miniseries for Dracula. But Bill wonders, what do you think of this list of movies, and what do you think of the portrayal of Dracula in modern film?
This assumes that Bill thinks I'm like a real movie expert.
Sure.
And, to a certain extent, I try, guys. I haven't seen all these movies in the list. I've seen everyone but one of them. And I try to, because whenever I go to conventions all over the world, people ask me. And it's one of these things, with all due respect, Bill, as an author, it's almost like, okay, you've written a book, you've worked your butt off, a couple of years of research, you write a book, and it comes out, and, it's a bestseller here, there. And it's like, oh, yeah, fine, buddy, but tell me, when's it going to become a movie?
Mm-hmm.
So to get validation, it's got to get a movie. And so it's not like I'm against the movies. I think they're wonderful, and it's a great broad audience, but I'm not as well-versed in the movies as I am in the literature side. So I'm going to take a stab at this. Number one, I got to know Jim Hart, the screenwriter for the 92 Coppola, very well. We've actually done presentations together. He talks about why he turned his movie into a love story. I talk about why Bram Stoker wrote it in the way that there's slight undertones of a little bit of love, but nothing like he introduced in 92. But it makes total sense at the time for this movie to be popular. He introduced this whole concept of Mina being his reincarnated wife. I love the fact that Gary Oldman, who's a big star, as was Anthony Hopkins and everyone else in that movie. Gary Oldman had great advantage over any other Draculas to have this incredible costumes and technology, even though there wasn't a ton of it at that time. The only problem I have with that movie was the name. It's not Bram Stoker's Dracula. It's not like they had to pay royalties or anything for that, but it is close to Bram Stoker's Dracula, but it's Jim Hart and Francis Ford Coppola's Dracula, because they did change it. There was, the first 4 minutes did something really cool. It used their own mythology to create this story of why Vlad became a vampire. So hats off. I like the movie. Gary Oldman, wonderful.
Maybe they should have called it close to Bram Stoker's Dracula.
Yeah. No, you're right. I would have been happy with that. But I also get it, because the same guys made Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, and so that was obviously a sort of a franchise they were doing, was tie it directly to the classic authors, but make their changes, which is fine. Right. The 74 Jack Palance, I have not seen that one, guys, so I really can't comment. Although when I sit on panels and everybody talks all about these books, many people think that's probably the second most faithful adaptation, other than jump to number one, the BBC version with Louis Jourdan. It was actually 1977. It was a miniseries. If you want to see a faithful adaptation of the novel Dracula, that's the best one going. It's dark. It's not got a whole lot of special effects or things, but it's like reading the book. So this is for those people in high school and colleges that are supposed to read the book for your Gothic English literature part of the course. Go watch that, and that'll help you. And then Christopher Lee, I think there was about 8 or 9 or maybe more that he starred in, but I'm going to pretend this is just a general Christopher Lee appearing as Dracula. He was my favorite just because he combined the nastiness as well as the suave and debonair. I mean, I like the 31 Bela Lugosi because it was so groundbreaking, but really the Draculas that Christopher Lee portrayed for Hammer and Cushing, his archenemy, they were awesome, charming. They had unbelievable females in the shows that showed just the right amount of strength, but vulnerability and flesh. So I think that's an admirable list. And tell Bill he's done a good job. You stumped me though on Jack Palance, so good for you.
You just made his day. Really, he's going to giggle like a schoolgirl singing in Barnes & Noble right now. We always put a ghost story on the show. Every episode, we usually have ghost stories, at least one, narrated by our voice actors or told by our guests. You said that you might have the makings of a ghost story you could tell us about.
Yeah, and I'll start off by saying I'm a skeptic. Mm-hmm. What happened to me in this situation, I was really trying to, no, Dacre, this is not happening. Come on, don't be stupid. So that's the frame it. So here I am, Marsh's library in Dublin, Ireland. I understood, because I've been there a number of times to do research, that there's actually a haunting of Marsh's library. There's a ghost of the Archbishop Marsh that the thing is named after. And what happened is, the legend has it that his daughter fell in love and eloped. And she was riddled with guilt, and she left a letter in one of the books in the library that the Archbishop, her father, was the benefactor of, and she ran away. And apparently, to this day, and there's like 25,000 books, and they're really old, really cool old stuff, old manuscripts. 1707 is what dates back to. And to this day, apparently, weird stuff have happened. Books have been kind of pulled out a little bit here, there. And it's like the Archbishop is looking for the note in the book, trying to get, redemption of his daughter. So I arrive a day early to give one of my Stoker on Stoker presentations at Marsh's library, and I want to do a check because I'm anal. I want to make sure my computer is going to be compatible with all their stuff. And so I go in near closing, because they said, come at the end of the day. We don't want to disrupt everybody. And so they say, Dacre, head on downstairs. You know that room where we've been there before. It's a conference room, to bring your laptop to go set up. So I head downstairs, and they have these sort of lights, and they're quite more common in Europe than they are over here. These ones that the lights only turn on when you walk by, and they sense you, so it saves electricity. And I'm kind of going down these steps, this stairwell. It's cold and it's dark. There's no windows now because I'm in a basement. And one of the lights turns on, and I'm walking, and the next one doesn't turn on, and I get a little disoriented, and I'm kind of ticked off, like, damn it, why aren't there lights on? I thought I knew the way to this room where I'm supposed to go. And I get disoriented, and there's all these rows of shelves of the books that they have in storage, not up on general display. And I'm sort of looking at these books. That's pretty cool. It's got this really weird smell, to it. And as I get closer and closer to where I think I need to go, I now realize I'm freaking lost down here. And I get mad at myself. So I got my backpack, I pull up my cell phone. I don't like to have to call and ask directions like most every male on this planet. So I've got to sheepishly call my guy upstairs, the curator, Jason McGelliot, and say, Jason, I'm downstairs. I can't freaking find my way. Can you come and get me? And of course, there's no signal. And so I'm going, damn, where do I go? So I'm now looking, and I see this very faint light in the distance. But I'm thinking, wait a sec, I don't remember any windows. It's 6:30 at night in October in Ireland. It's pitch black outside anyway. So I head to the light. And when I get close to the light's gone. So I think, well, maybe it was one of those lights, that comes out underneath the door, that somebody's in the room I'm trying to get to, but the door's locked. There's no light. So damn this. I get my phone out, and then I turn the flashlight portion of my phone on. And I finally sort of work my way around and find myself to this one room that I'm sort of mad that, somebody should have brought me down there. And I go into the room. It's really freaking cold. And I just feel that there is somebody around. And I open up my laptop, try to turn the thing on. The battery's dead.
Oh.
And it's never been dead.
There we go.
Never. I didn't leave it on. It's just something is affected this. And I just think, I thought back for a moment and said, damn, maybe I have, possibly I visited with the Archbishop. Maybe I've had my first encounter. I don't know. Finally, somebody shows up, the person who's supposed to be there in about 5 minutes. But it's an awful long 5 minutes, guys. And I ended up plugging in the computer, and it shows that the battery had all drained down to zero, and the computer wasn't on. And then I go back to my place, I do the check, and I go home. I have never had that problem with the computer since then.
Right. Wow. And Phil, that reminds us of what happened to us at the Jersey Shore at Cape May. We found both of our independent microphones with different batteries in them. Both died at exactly the same time when we were in this haunted lobby of the hotel, the Marquis de Lafayette, at the beach. And it was just so uncanny that both microphones died at exactly the same time, because I was recording and noticed that the sign file had stopped transmitting, and it was just dead. And both of our mics had just completely died.
Our mics are completely separate batteries, separate everything. And how do you explain that? I mean, maybe there was some kind of energy near us, just draining our batteries.
And we hear that, of course, from paranormal investigators who talk about their batteries being drained and having.
Oh, it's happened to me before, yeah. I mean, not just that one time, but other times.
So, when you're doing a podcast at a haunted place, make sure you have plenty of batteries.
Yeah.
That's a public service
Bring
message.
that external battery pack, yeah.
I'm going to alter, that's a wonderful story, Dacre, but I'm going to alter the ending. In my mind, after you check your laptop, you are fallen upon by 10 or 20 different vampires who are hiding around the shelves, and they drain your blood and turn you into a mortal being of the undead. So that's just edit Fox right
I'll
there.
go with that. Hey, I'm all for good editing. It makes the story better. So I'm with you.
So what's going on for you now? Any projects you'd like to tell us about?
Yeah, I've got a really cool one happening on Kickstarter right now called Unearthed, Bram Stoker Rare Papers. And actually three of the rare papers that I've got licenses for. I've got over like 100 different rare papers from Bram Stoker's life, his research and writing of Dracula, letters sent to him by people about Dracula and so on. And three of them actually come from Marsh's library. And one of them is like the proof that Bram Stoker went there in 1866 and the books he checked out that day. And one of those books actually had a reference to Vlad Dracula. So these different museums that I've traveled to for about 15 years, I realized for the average fan, you're not going to get to go see all this stuff. So I found a guy, Vic Nadada from Gemini Artifacts, who does actually create stage props and things for the theaters. He does replicas. And so he is in the middle of replicating and not just sticking the piece of paper through a fancy photocopy. I mean, it's like an 8-step process and to make replica of these really cool papers. So it's funded, so we're going ahead. We're just trying to sell more. So it's Unearthed, Bram Stoker Rare Papers on Kickstarter. And then the other cool thing is it just premiered yesterday, actually, was the a documentary, one episode. I've only done one so far, but it's sort of my search for all things that went into Bram Stoker's research and writing. And actually, we have discovered, and I'm not the only one, there's other people involved, but I was the one that actually went to Transylvania with the information of the lines of longitude and latitude that Bram Stoker left in his notebook for where his fictional castle Dracula is.
Oh, interesting.
And my Romanian friends know it's not Bran Castle. That was actually the exterior description that he used from one of the books from the London Library, but he actually placed the fictional castle Dracula 400 miles to the north, as you can guess, right near the Borgo Pass. And this was on the side of a old volcano. And I started the show, guys, telling you that I would close this loop because the original ending of Dracula that I discovered when I looked at the Dracula typescript, and this page is also in the Unearthed, Paul Allen, the Microsoft co-founder, owns the Dracula typescript.
Oh.
And when J.D. Barker and I analyzed this typescript to find out what was missing and what was not, I actually found that there was an original ending that was crossed out right after the Count had his heart stabbed by Quincy Morris's Bowie knife and his throat slit by Jonathan Harker's kukri blade. He crumbled into dust. Had this ending stayed in, a volcano would have erupted and sent Castle Dracula tumbling down. And all the good guys take off and the gypsies take off and the Count is crumbled into dust and Dacre Stoker wouldn't have been able to write a sequel.
Wow.
But as it stands, typical of Bram Stoker, as detail-oriented as he was, if he was going to have a volcano at the end of his story, he was darn well going to make sure that Castle Dracula was on an old volcano, and that Mount Israel, based on those lines of longitude and latitude that he stuck in his Dracula notes in the Rosenbach Museum, proved that to be true.
That's wonderful. That's a wonderful story, and I'm glad we have that here on episode 150 of Vampire Lore with Dacre Stoker. And it's been incredible speaking to Dacre Stoker, and I hope our audience really is listening to this right before Halloween, because vampires are so great at Halloween. I'm sure there'll be many vampires out on the street. Though, remember, practice safety, keep social distance, don't endanger your neighbors, and follow COVID-19 regulations. You can celebrate Halloween this year, but do it safely and respectfully, or find other ways of doing it. That's something we're being very careful here about on What Are You Afraid Of, is that we have to protect each other. But we've been speaking to Dacre Stoker, and it's been wonderful and informative on episode 150, Vampire Lore. We'll be back before Halloween with Empire 151. We'll be speaking to Michelle Belanger. She is a psychic. She has been on Paranormal State, Paranormal Lockdown. She's on Portals to Hell. She's an author about all things vampire, psychic energy. She considers herself a vampire. And of course, she's a psychic that's on television. We'll be speaking to her tomorrow, and that will be on episode 151, which will come out on the Friday before Halloween. This is What Are You Afraid of? Horror and Paranormal Show. We're on Parax Radio Friday nights at 9 p.m. Eastern Time. Check out our website for more information about Dacre and these projects he's speaking about, plus the books at www.whatareyoufraidofpodcast.com for a page on every episode, our growing archive of ghost stories with audio narration, plus new facts and articles like the article I just wrote on Shudder and my review of the Mortuary Collection and Creepshow and that wonderful return to tactile horror. Dacre, it's been wonderful speaking to you. Thank you for coming on the show.
Great questions, great feedback on some of the things that I floated to you, but thank you so much for your time and best of luck with the continuing success of your podcast, and have a very safe, happy Halloween yourselves, guys.
Thank you very much. You too, and continued success. And it was an honor to meet and talk with you.
It really was. This is T. Fox Dunham.
And this is Phil Thomas.
And the Dracula slowly moving in, and this fluid exchange is just nowadays like watching an episode of True Blood or Vampire Diaries, where people are going at it full frontal and everything.
T. Fox Dunham lives in Philadelphia with his wife, Allison. He's a lymphoma survivor, cancer patient, modern bard and historian. His first book, The Street Martyr, was published by Gutter Books. A television series based on the book is being produced by Throughline Films. Destroying the Tangible Illusion of Reality or Searching for Andy Kaufman, a book about what it's like to be dying of cancer, was released from Perpetual Motion Machine Publishing, and Fox is a story in the Stargate anthology Points of Origin from MGM and Fandemonium Books. Fox is an active member of the Horror Writers Association, and he's had published hundreds of short stories and articles. His motto is Wrecking Civilization, one story at a time. Find out more information at www.tfoxdunham.com.
Phil Thomas is an author and screenwriter from the suburbs of Philadelphia. His screenplays have been produced into 2 feature films, False Face and Always from Darkness, and are available in major retailers such as Best Buy and Target, as well as availability on Netflix and Amazon Prime on demand. His screenplay, 3 Tunnels, was a semi-finalist at the LA Screenplay Competition. He is a member of the International Association of Professional Writers and Editors, and he currently writes for Cultured Vultures, Game Skinny, and BloodyDisgusting.com. He formerly held the position of Senior Marketing Manager at Eternal Press, and was a journalist for Patch, where he wrote a daily tech column covering the latest electronics and gadgets. He lives in the suburbs of Philadelphia, and is currently working on his second novel, Worst Afterlife Ever.
The views expressed and the opinions given by the individual host and their guests do not necessarily reflect those of Para X, its affiliates, or its sponsors.